Shabbat Shalom. So when I got up there after the Torah reading, before the Haftarah reading, some of you may have noticed me sort of looking around and panicking a little bit. So Michael Scheib cleverly, when he was taking his stuff, took my sermon notes. But I found them, okay? So, Shabbat Shalom. So I actually spoke on Yom Kippur. One of the things that I mentioned on Yom Kippur was data that indicates that the older an American Jew is, the more likely it is that supporting Israel is considered important to them and a crucial part of their Jewishness. And again, this is just a fact. It's not a judgment, it's a fact, right? And you know, as I've heard, many facts don't care about your feelings, right? But this fact was borne out again in the mayoral election in New York City, right? Where the Jewish vote in the general election split about 2-to-1 overall for Cuomo over Mamdani. But the younger vote broke towards very much towards Mamdani, and it's hard to know exactly because, you know, like we don't, but if you take certain neighborhoods as sort of Jewish one, but populated significantly by younger Jews who are not Orthodox, like Park Slope in Brooklyn, for example, where my stepbrother lives. Well, he's not so young anymore, but I don't know who he voted for, but 60 to 75% of people in those neighborhoods voted for Mamdani. And to the extent that we have data, it's also 70% of younger Jews voted for Mamdani. Okay? It's just a fact. And just another datum that came up really after I made my notes. So the commencement speaker at JTS, this year Jewish Theological Seminary, is President Herzog of Israel. And you know, JTS, I mean, people think of JTS as a rabbinical school, which it is, but it's not only a rabbinical school. Right, there are other programs. I mean, I have an education degree from there. There's also List College, right, which is a joint program. So undergraduates are simultaneously enrolled at JTS and at either Columbia or Barnard, and they get 2 bachelor's degrees, and they participate in this commencement too. And there are about 50 graduating seniors, and it was a petition to disinvite President Herzog as the graduation speaker, and predictably on RobNet, which is the email list for conservative rabbi, oh my God, what has happened to JTS? When I was there, it was solidly Zionist, and da-da-da-da-da. 6 students signed this petition. Okay? Not exactly were, you know, something panic, about 6 students. Now, 6 out of 50, right? So it's not like 6 out of 2,000, it is more than 10%, but then there was a counter petition signed by 24 students. And not a single student who's being ordained as a rabbi this year signed this petition, but you know, the fact of the matter is that, I mean, to a certain extent, it was reported in places like the Forward because it kind of confirmed their bias, right? And I think it is true. I mean, I don't think, certainly when I was an undergraduate, you would have found, 11% of the Jews in my graduating class willing to sign a petition saying, don't have a president of Israel so the convention is here. So things have changed. Perhaps not as much as, people who like to panic, but things have definitely changed. But I think one thing that is true and has been true almost always is that American Jews and Israeli Jews have different senses of what it means to be a Jew. Right? And there's been, academic study on this. There's a professor, Aryeh Carmon, who is an expert on the relationship between Israel and diaspora Jews. He writes, and I think he's correct, that Israel and the American Jewish community both started as offshoots of the Eastern European Jewish community, right? And I think that's true. I mean, for example, you had, and you saw it even in Fiddler on the Roof, right? I mean, you had, one sibling who came to America and one sibling who went to Israel, right? I mean, Fiddler on the Roof is fascinating in terms of portraying the actual history, right? You had 4 daughters, right? One intermarried, she's gone. Okay, now that is a big difference because people are no longer gone because they married somebody who's not a Jew, right? But 125 years ago, for sure, right? One was a communist, wound up in Siberia, right? One came to America and one went to Israel, right? So, and like very common. I mean, those, if you have cousins in Israel, it's probably because your grandparent came here and one of their siblings went to Israel, right? So they're both offshoots of Eastern European Jewry, and Israelis inherited the facet of Jewish identity as daily life in an all-Jewish environment. Right, which the Shteta was. I mean, Eastern Europe was certainly not all Jewish, but the towns where Jews lived mostly were, right? And Americans experienced Judaism as a series of choices, right, and a way to look at things. And Israel and the American Jewish community might have evolved closer to each other, but there was the Shoah, the Holocaust, right? And they're both cut off from that same source, which doesn't exist anymore, right? So they're orphans bereft of a mother, right? And so they've grown up like orphans raised in different homes, right? And I think that this is true, right? And so Carmon says that he's an Israeli, but he says the fact of the matter is that we are a diasporic nation, right? I mean, there are 2 Talmuds, right? The Talmud of Babylonia and the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael, right? Which is the Talmud that is authoritatively warranted, right? The Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, right? When there were differences recorded in the Talmud between the customs of Eretz Yisrael and the customs of Babel, Babylonia, we follow, for the most part, the customs of Babylonia, right? I mean, who was the greatest philosopher of Judaism? Maimonides. Where did he live? Spain, and then Egypt, right? Who's the greatest Bible commentator? Rashi. Where did he live? France. Okay? We are a diasporic culture, right? But many Israelis still believe in an ideology known as Shlilat Gola, negation of the diaspora. And there was a big kerfuffle recently because a prominent columnist in Haaretz wrote that American Jews, and Haaretz is a left-leaning publication, but actually it's not, well, let me say what he said before I'll tell you why I'm not surprised. American Jews are traitors, and we should give them until 2030 to move to Israel, and any American Jew who hasn't moved to Israel by 2030, done. Done. We are done with them. Okay, now, why am I not surprised? Actually, because many Israeli progressives or liberals say, you know, all we need, like, if 2 million Jews from America made Aliyah, Bibi would be out of office permanently, and, you know, the left would start winning elections. Okay? And they're right, except 2 million American Jews are not making Aliyah anytime soon, and certainly not by 2030. Right? But this idea of, like, negation of the diaspora is not uncommon in Israel even to this day. And Carmon says that this is a big mistake. We need each other. Right? And I believe that that's true. And I've said this for a long time, that Israel would do well to be more like the American Jewish community, with a kind of pluralism of thought and ways of being Jewish, and the idea that democracy doesn't mean just that the majority can do whatever it wants, but the minority has rights that cannot be taken away from them. Israel should be more like America, and the American Jewish community should be more like Israel, right? That there is such a thing as Jewish culture and Jewish music and Jewish literature and a kind of richness and seamlessness of Jewish life that exists in Israel that for the most part doesn't exist here, right? So, and I really believe this, both communities would be better off if they started looking more like each other. Okay, but Rabbi Jonathan Sachs wrote something which I think also kind of gets at the heart of this debate, and that is the question of what is the meaning of Shavuot? What is Shavuot about? Okay, because the paragraph which is in this parsha that tells us to observe Shavuot is intentionally mistranslated in our daily and weekly Siddur, right? But here's what it says, right? So the day after Pesach, well, it doesn't say that. On a certain day you bring an omer of grain. Okay, a sheaf of grain, and it says, from the day on which you bring the sheaf of elevations offering, the omer, the day after the Sabbath Shabbat, you shall count off 7 weeks. Okay, so at the time of the Second Temple, right, there were 2 main groups in Judaism, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Right, and then the Sadducees, so became the Karaites, okay, which you may not know. They did. Okay. You may not even know what Karaites are, but Karaites are today a very small group of Jews who say we only follow the Bible, right? And the two main places where Karaites existed were Egypt and the Crimea, right? And it may not surprise you, therefore, that there are not a lot of Karaites left anymore, but there is a Karaite community in Israel, and there's a Karaite community in Daly City, California, the only Karaite synagogue in the United States. Okay? But the Sadducees and the Karaites make this ridiculous argument. And it says when you should start to count on the day after the Shabbat, they absurdly think that the word Shabbat in that verse means Shabbat. Whereas we know it means the first day of Pesach. Well, how's the first day of Pesach? Shabbat? Because you're not allowed to work on it, so it's a Shabbat, right? So Karaites start counting the Omer on the Sunday, or the Saturday night, after Pesach, right? They start counting the Omer the Saturday night after the first day of Pesach. We start counting the Omer the second night of Pesach, right? The night of the second day. Now, all right, so what? Well, okay, so as a result, Karaite Shavuot is always on Sunday. Karaite Shavuot is always on Sunday, but it's not on the same date, right? For us, Shavuot is not on the same day of the week, but it is the same date. It is always the 6th of Sivan. Okay, now you say, all right, so what? Right. But for the Karaites, the original agricultural meaning of Shavuot was the meaning that they preserved, right? Whereas for us, what is Shavuot, right? It's Zman Achilat Blintzes, right? The day that we eat blintzes, right? No, and she's right. No, it's the day that the Torah was given, right? That's not in the Torah at all. At all. It was deduction by the rabbis that decided that the giving of the Torah was on the 6th of Sivan. Right? But, so two different meanings of the holidays, right? But here's the kicker, and this is why, I mean, you may have gotten a hint that I think that actually the way the Sadducees started counting is actually correct. But what can I do, right? We're not a Karaitic congregation, okay? And you wouldn't want to be a Karaitic congregation because they sit on the floor during services, okay? If for no other reason, right?
That's the only reason?
No, there's a lot.
It's the only necessary reason for most of us, right? For most of us, it's the only necessary reason, right? Everything else is a commentary, right? But if you have a holiday that commemorates a certain historical event, the holiday should be on the date of that event, okay? And here I am absolutely 100% convinced, right? Because we have a lot of holidays that we have the Monday holiday for, right? And so we want to give people a 3-day weekend, so instead of celebrating on the actual date, right, we celebrate it on the nearest Monday. Why don't we do that with Independence Day? Because nobody calls Independence Day Independence Day, they call it 4th of July. Right? And could you imagine saying, when does the 4th of July fall this year? Oh, this year the 4th of July is the 6th of July. No! the 4th of July has to be on the 4th of July. Right? Why? Because otherwise it's not the 4th of July, right? If we called it Independence Day, it might actually have become a Monday holiday. But we call it the 4th of July, so it has to be the 4th of July, right? And if you're going to commemorate the Torah being given on the 6th of Sivan, Shavuot has to fall on the 6th of Sivan, right? But it's about, in other words, what is Judaism about, okay? And is Judaism about living in a certain land, or is it about following a certain book? Okay, right? In other words, what makes us Jews? Is it our connection to Eretz Yisrael, or is it our connection to the Torah, right? And I think it is certain. And look, this is not, I mean, you know me, right? Israel is not unimportant to me at all. At all. You know, and there's lots of Israeli things that are part of my life, and concern for Israel. Look, there are 7 million Jews who live in Israel, right? If for no other reason, it's important that, you know, things go well for them, right? Now, how do we make things go well? That can be, you know, we can debate that, right? But Israel is certainly important to me, but it is not the focus of my Jewish identity, right? The focus of my Jewish identity is mitzvot, it's culture, it's the Jewish people, wherever they are. Whether they're here, whether they're there, whether they're, you know, in other countries. I mean, I have, you know, officiated as a rabbi. I mean, not as a full-time job, but in Australia, and in the Bahamas, and in Mexico, and all, right, wherever Jews are, that's important to me. But Israel, as important as it is not the focus of my Jewish identity. But this debate actually goes back, according to Rabbi Sachs, to the Second Temple, to the Talmud, right? To the debate over when we start counting the Omer, and as a result, when does Shavuot fall? And, you know, Rabbi Sachs also, you know, falls on the side of, you know, it has to if you're a rabbinic Jew, right? That it is the giving of the Torah that is the focus of what it means to be a Jew, and that has to put Shavuot on the 6th of Sivan. Yeah, Michael?
A conversation, the last time I was in Israel, which was almost 20 years ago, I was on bed, we were looking for a souvenir. So I was looking for a souvenir that was, you know, something that showed of Israel. And everything they had was something that was Jewish.
Right.
As a Jewish symbol. And I was talking to the counselor, I was like, no. That's a Jewish symbol, that's not an Israeli symbol.
Right.
The two are different, and they had no understanding.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I had a conversation, I mean, it's a long time ago. Okay? I was in college talking to a young woman who was in high school who asked me to explain the difference between a Jew and an Israeli. Right? But I get that because I'll wipe it up. But so when I lived in Israel, right? When I lived in Israel, I was a board member of a camp, a summer camp that was meant to bring together, to bridge the gap between Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis. Okay, in other words, Arab, I mean, today, right back then, they called themselves Israeli Arabs or Arab Israelis. Today, they call themselves Palestinian citizens of Israel. But we're not talking about the West Bank or Gaza. We're talking about people who are Israeli citizens. And I was on the board of this camp to bring together Palestinian Israelis and Jewish Israelis. And we're at a board meeting, and the director of the camp is giving an update on registration, and he says, so far we have 150 Israelis and 100 Arabs. And I rose my hand and I said, I move to close the camp. What are you talking about? I said, not 150 Israelis and 100 Arabs. It's 250 Israelis, of whom 150 are Jewish and 100 Arab. Right? But if the director of the camp does not realize that Israeli citizens who are Arab are Israelis, then you can't run this camp. Right? You can't, it'd be like if I started a sermon, right, and I started my sermon in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, right? As soon as Shabbat was over, Lori would be on the phone, Rabbi, we think you're a really nice guy. This is not the right job for you, right? And so you're right. I mean, there's Jewish and there's Israeli and there's the Venn diagram overlaps a lot, but not by 100%. So you're absolutely correct. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Rabbi, when I was ever so much younger, starting I guess around the age of 4 or 5, my grandfather came from Austria, Vienna, and my grandmother came from what's now Ukraine, was then Minsk, part of the And she belonged to this organization which has evolved in different philosophical ways. Initially it was Drasha. And my grandfather was a gun runner or a facilitator of that. Anyway, I remember from the earliest time we would walk into my grandparents' home, and there would be, I don't know, I hope everybody here knows the term pushka. It was in all kinds of forms.
Yeah, the collection.
I know, but some people don't know.
No, so I'm explaining.
So from the littlest time, we would go home with a pushka, and we were supposed to collect pennies or any place we wanted. This ties to, believe it or not, because those pushkas were written in Hebrew, had an English translation, and it was money to provide food for the poor in Palestine,
Right.
not in Israel. And I'm sorry?
Yeah.
And it seems to me, knowing what I was teaching, there were unless you were in certain schools, and it's probably still true today, there were some schools that had almost no Jews. There were only 2 Jews at Sherwood when I was teaching, and we were both teachers. And then you move to a school like Wooten, and you have not a large population, but an active population.
Right.
The point is that I'm seeing now the children and grandchildren of my social group. And birthright, in my opinion, from what I'm observing from the kids talking, is really changing a lot of attitudes in kids from, how old are they, 14, 15?
Well,
like that.
birthright I agree, Colin, but yeah.
Well, but it also ties itself to the original movie of Exodus with the whole split.
Right. I mean, I think, and I want to wrap up, but there was data to indicate that that is correct. I think that it's less and less the case. Okay, I think that it's less and less the case, and why that is complicated, which I won't even begin to go into, but I think, if you were talking 15, 20 years ago, you would have absolutely spot on. I think it is, the data is indicating that that Birthright is not having the same kind of impact that it had, you know, when it was a newer program. Anyway, Shabbat Shalom.